Okay, so we're going to continue on and survey the different types of protists. So we're going to talk about each supergroup one at a time and discuss some of their characteristics, what they do, kind of how they fit into all this. We are going to begin with the supergroup Archaeplastida. Now, Archaeplastida is going to be a really important supergroup. This includes the red and the green algae. And as you can see in the phylogeny here, red and green algae are the closest relatives of the land plants. The reason that this is such an important group is that the chloroplast that is found in red and green algae comes from cyanobacterium from a primary endosymbiosis. So as we'll see, the vast majority of photosynthetic protists got their ability to do photosynthesis from this primary endosymbiosis. That was that endosymbiosis where a cell engulfed another cell, that first step of endosymbiosis. All right, so let's talk about these different groups. We'll start with the red algae. Red algae have sometimes been referred to as rhodophytes. Rhodo means red. Phyte is a word we're going to run into quite a bit. Phyte is a root word that means plant. So we refer to these as the red plants, even though we no longer consider them to be plants, right? But because they're photosynthetic, historically we considered them to be plants, so they were known as the rhodophytes. But now we say they're algae. We are, again, I think I mentioned this before, we're going to try to limit the use of the word algae to only photosynthetic eukaryotes, so red algae would be a good example there. That photosynthetic ability comes from their use of a pigment known as phycoerythrin. Phycoerythrin is an accessory pigment in photosynthesis that helps the red algae to be able to capture sunlight energy and convert that into chemical energy. The coloration of red algae varies depending on where you find them. In really shallow water, so right at the surface, they tend to be a lighter red. As you get in deep water, they get to be a darker red until they're almost black. And the reason for this is pretty straightforward, and that is different wavelengths of light penetrate water differently. And so when you think about the surface, you're talking about pretty close to the same wavelengths of light that a land plant gets on land. As you get deeper, though, not all wavelengths make it so deep, and so by changing that coloration, they're able to control how much of that light that is making it down there, they're able to get. Red algae are pretty important to us because these are the wraps that go around sushi rolls are made of red algae. So if you've ever eaten a sushi roll, then you have eaten a protist, and specifically a red alga. We're going to move on to green algae. In green algae, we find a chloroplast structure that's really similar to land plants. So as you can see in the phylogeny, I think these are the closest relatives of the land plants. There are those who would argue that these are actually part of the plant kingdom. And so I would ask, how do we make that decision? If we take a look at the phylogeny, we usually define the plant kingdom as just the land plants here. But there are some who argue that we should expand it to the charophyte green algae, right, the sister taxon of the land plants, or to both the chlorophyte and the charophyte green algae. So include all three of these lineages. So how do we decide where to draw the line on that plant kingdom? Right? Is it here? Is it here? Or is it here? How do we decide? What would we do? Would we need to do some sort of, I don't know, DNA tests? Compare the morphology, look at the chloroplast structure? How would we decide what ought to include in that plant kingdom? Well, the answer is, it's kind of whatever you want. The definition of a kingdom is pretty nebulous, just like the definition of every other group of classification. There's no sort of guideline as to how many species go into a kingdom, how much genetic diversity, how much morphological diversity. Really, we put things into a kingdom based on what's kind of traditionally been in there and whatever the person who's writing the paper feels like. Right? Could you make a kingdom that include the land plants and the charophyte green algae? Sure. That'd be appropriate. It's monophyletic. No problem. Could you include the chlorophyte green algae? Sure. Could you include just land plants? Yes. It's pretty arbitrary. It's pretty subjective based on what any individual really feels should be there or not. There's no real way to define, here's how much should be in a kingdom. It's really just based on tradition. In fact, and I'll just mention this, in fact, because of that, there are a lot of scientists now that argue we should kind of get rid of those levels of classification because they don't really mean much. Right? A kingdom of plants doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as a kingdom of fungi or a kingdom of animals, that it's all kind of arbitrary what gets put into kingdoms and what doesn't. So just something to think about. Let's see. Most green algae are found in fresh water. Although there are some exceptions to that. For example, if you take a look at this picture here, you might notice this snow has kind of a pinkish coloration to it. Now, if you're like me, you probably look at that and say, I know what happened there. Probably there was one of those rescue helicopters had to go up in the mountains. And while it was up there, a mountain goat jumped off of a cliff and landed on the rotors, and that's blood that's been splattered all over the snow there. Well, it turns out that's not actually the case. But instead, this is sometimes referred to as watermelon snow, has this pinkish coloration, and it is actually a green alga that lives in the snow. Now, I know what you're thinking here. Well, wait a second. If this is a green alga, why is it not green? It's got a pinkish coloration. Shouldn't this be a red alga? But of course, right? We put things in groups not based on their phenotypic characteristics, but based on their evolutionary history, based upon who they're related to. So this is a green alga, even though phenotypically it looks more like a red alga. Right? That it's not about those phenotypic characteristics, about evolutionary history. And this is more closely related to those other green algae than they are to a red alga. Now, within the green algae, there are two lineages, the chlorophyte green algae and the charophyte green algae. We're going to start talking about the chlorophyte green algae. What's the root word chloro mean? It means green. And what's phyte mean? First rule is you don't talk about Fight Club. Phyte means plant. So chlorophyte technically means green plant. I'm going to use this group to just give you kind of an idea of the diversity that we see in just this one subgroup, right, within the supergroup of these protists. I hope you get impressed as we go along by the diversity throughout the protists, and especially here in the chlorophytes, we get to see a good example of that. So, let's start with this genus Chlamydomonas. So Chlamydomonas, you can see in the picture there, it's a single-celled organism, has a couple of flagella coming off of it there. And let's take a look at the life cycle. All right, so my first question is, does this life cycle have sexual reproduction? Well, the answer is yes, right? Here's meiosis, here's fertilization. We know that if meiosis is happening here, that means over here, this must be diploid, and this must be haploid. And then fertilization, we take two haploid cells, produce diploid. All right, so we have sexual reproduction. Do we have asexual reproduction? Well, yes, up here, since Chlamydomonas is single-celled, these little loops, those little loops of mitosis are asexual reproduction, making more copies of this single-celled Chlamydomonas based on just this mitosis, taking one cell, splitting it into two. All right, so we found that there's sexual reproduction, there's asexual reproduction. Would you say that this life cycle is dominated by the haploid or diploid part of the life cycle? All right, well, just to remind you, if meiosis is happening here, that means this must be haploid, 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 haploid. It only becomes diploid here. So this life cycle, single-celled all the time, but this life cycle is very much dominated by the haploid part of the life cycle. Here we have two haploid cells coming together in fertilization. Right? This is the only part that's diploid. Everything else is haploid. Single-celled, haploid-dominated life cycle, both sexual and asexual reproduction in cute little Chlamydomonas. Also notice the green coloration because, of course, this is a photosynthesizer. All right, another example of a chlorophyte green alga then is Volvox. Look how cool this thing is. So Volvox are these spheres made up of individual cells. Each of these little dots here is a single cell in a sphere, and then we've got these spheres inside of these spheres. The smaller ones are the daughter colonies of Volvox, and then the bigger thing is the adult, the parent colony. And so Volvox is our example of a colonial green alga. A bunch of individual cells living together, each cell able to carry out all the functions of life, but they live together in a group, specifically in this sphere. Another example of a green alga then is ulva. Ulva is sometimes referred to as sea lettuce because people use it on salads. It's a pretty large organism. It is multicellular. So we have a multicellular green alga here in the form of ulva. And then, last possibility, we have caulerpa. Caulerpa kind of looks like ulva. It's kind of like these big leaves. But it turns out that caulerpa is multinucleate. So, caulerpa is made up of basically each of those leaves is a giant cell with lots and lots and lots and lots of nuclei. It looks multicellular, but if you look inside, it's not divided up into individual cells. So here's my point. Within this subgroup of the green algae, the chlorophytes, we find single-celled, colonial, multicellular, and multinucleate, all in that same group. A large amount of diversity, despite the fact that we're just within one subgroup. Protists tend to be diverse at every level. All right, we're going to talk about the charophyte green algae when we get to the land plants. So for now, we are going to move on to our next supergroup, the amoebozoa. All right, so amoebozoa are a pretty interesting group of protists. They have pseudopodia, and those pseudopodia tend to be relatively wide, so lobe-shaped or tube-shaped pseudopodia. These are kind of the classic amoeba you might think of. And all of the amoebozoans are heterotrophs, so none of these are doing photosynthesis, but instead are consuming other organisms or taking things in, breaking them down. The first group of amoebozoans we're going to talk about are the slime molds. Slime molds are pretty weird stuff. If you're ever outside and you see something that looks a lot like colorful dog vomit, there's a decent chance it's a slime mold. Could also be colorful dog vomit, but maybe it's going to be a slime mold. Slime molds produce these fruiting bodies. You can see in the pictures on the left there. Those fruiting bodies are going to produce spores. They have this kind of crazy life cycle. So here's a life cycle of one type of slime mold. So let's start up here. I guess let's start with the spores. So here are these haploid spores, and those spores can turn into either a flagellated form or an amoeboid form. Still single-celled, but either flagellated or amoeboid. And then at some point, two of those cells are going to fuse together, so fertilization. So these are haploid cells fusing together, producing a diploid zygote. All right, so that diploid cell that's produced then goes through multiple rounds of mitosis, right? So making copies, but no cytokinesis. So in other words, you end up with basically a giant cell with many nuclei in it. A multinucleate mass. We're going to refer to it as a plasmodium here. That's what this thing would look like. This is when I've seen slime mold. We had one outside our house once. This is pretty much what it looked like. It was growing on the mulch in my wife's flower bed, and it looked like this fuzzy yellowish stuff on the mulch there. All right, at some point, that plasmodium is going to decide that it's time to produce spores. So to do that, this stalk grows out of it and produces a sporangium. A sporangium is just a place where spores are produced. And inside that sporangium, meiosis takes place. So these diploid cells then go through meiosis to produce haploid spores. And we're back to the beginning of our slime mold life cycle. All right, so just to point out how weird protists are, right? You could ask the question, well, how many slime molds are there? In this stage, when they're either an amoeboid cell or a flagellated cell, they're basically single-celled. In this stage, there are a bunch of different nuclei, but they're all kind of one giant cell. So is it a lot? Is it a few? Is it one? And the question is, yeah, the answer is, good question. Now, there's another type of slime mold. We're not going to go into great detail on the life cycle, but I just want to point out that there's this really weird thing that this other type of slime mold does. That a bunch of cells get together. They don't fuse, but they just kind of hang out together and produce this slug-like structure that can actually crawl around and move, and it's all coordinated. Even though it's not a multicellular organism, it's just a bunch of single cells hanging out together. It's big enough to be seen with the naked eye and can move around. I actually have a video here, one of the early pioneers' research on these slime molds, a guy named John Bonner. This is his videos showing some of the, what you can only call behavior, really, of slime molds, even though they're these relatively simple, single-celled most of the time, eukaryotic organisms. That these slime molds are kind of coordinating. They must be communicating. They must be deciding what to do. I mean, look at that. Look at that. How do they know to do that? Look at them coalescing. Yeah, so pretty interesting research. Pretty interesting organisms. Very different than most organisms we think about. All right, those are slime molds. Another type of amoebozoan are the ones we're going to call the gymnamoebas. And gymnamoebas are kind of the classic unicellular heterotrophic amoeba. I actually have this kind of crazy video that shows a classic amoeba eating. So let's take a look at this. So what we're going to see is here are a couple of paramecium up here on the right, and here's this amoeba surrounding them. And then we're going to get to this point where all of a sudden the paramecium are going to say, uh-oh, something's wrong. But by then it's too late. The amoeba's already surrounded them. They're trapped, nowhere to go. That's how they get eaten. Phagocytosis, right, now is going to dump enzymes in there. In fact, that might be what caused those paramecium to start freaking out to begin with, right, is when they all of a sudden, digestive enzymes were added to that food vacuole, and now they're trapped. All right, so that's slime molds, gymnamoebas. We only have one type of amoebozoan left then. Those are the entamoebas. Hopefully you never have opportunity to become familiar with entamoebas, because entamoebas are parasitic and can lead to things like amoebic dysentery. So not a really exciting organism to look at, and an even less exciting organism to have living inside of your body. That is dangerous, bad, unhealthy stuff. All right, let's move on to our next supergroup. Also, I forgot to mention, if you look up here in the top left, I'm going to keep this phylogeny here for every slide. And so I've got it marked which one we're currently talking about. So if you ever get confused as to where we are, look up there. That'll get you oriented. All right, our next supergroup then is the Opisthokonta. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about Opisthokonta. You can see in the Opisthokonta, we have two of our traditional groups of organisms, the fungi and the animals that we're probably more familiar with. We can see that we have here the protists would be those that are the closest relatives of animals, so these organisms are called the choanoflagellates. So we have a picture here of choanoflagellates. We think probably the earliest animals were pretty similar to this, and the current choanoflagellates are also similar to this. And I'll also just mention we also have the closest relatives of the fungi are within the Opisthokonta. So animals and fungi relatively close related to each other, and then these other protist groups that are also in that supergroup. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on these, but just wanted to introduce them because they're close relatives to some other major groups of life.